Behind the marble temples of Athens stood thousands of enslaved bodies bought and sold for pleasure. While philosophers debated virtue and democracy, a parallel economy thrived in the shadows, one built entirely on exploitation. In ancient Greece, sexuality was not a matter of freedom or intimacy. It was an industry controlled by men of wealth and power. Slavery fed this trade. Young women and boys, often captured during wars or sold by desperate families, were forced into service as entertainers, concubines, or temple attendants. Their value was measured not by their humanity but by the profit they could generate. Brothels lined the streets near the Athenian agora, and the state openly taxed the trade as if it were any other business. Religious institutions also played their part, turning certain temples into centers of ritualized prostitution, justified under the name of the gods. To the public eye, this was civilization, refined, artistic, and cultured. Yet beneath the polished sculptures and poetic verses lay a system of sanctioned abuse, where pleasure for the few was built on suffering for the many. The truth of ancient Greece is not only in its art and philosophy, but also in its silence, the deliberate erasure of those who served unseen. Before we uncover more of these hidden realities and the cruel systems that sustained them, please like this video and subscribe. Your support helps us continue exposing the darker side of history and give voice to those who were never allowed to speak. In ancient Athens, sex was not an act of love, but an organized trade that shaped the city's economy. Brothels were licensed and taxed by the state, turning exploitation into public revenue. The poorest citizens could buy access to another human being for less than the cost of a loaf of bread. Enslaved women and young boys, often taken during wars or imported through trade routes, were sold and rented as living property. They were priced like livestock, valued for appearance, youth, and obedience. Records show that wealthy citizens owned entire houses of pleasure, where dozens of captives worked day and night under strict control. Failure to please clients meant punishment, hunger, or sale to harsher owners. The Athenian government treated prostitution as a civic necessity, justifying it as a way to maintain social order among men. Philosophers like Solon even helped formalize these laws, proving how deeply normalized the trade had become. Yet the same society that praised ideals of beauty and virtue profited from a system built on coercion. Every coin exchanged in those crowded streets supported a chain of human suffering, hidden behind marble walls and state approval. Beneath the surface of civilization lay an economy that thrived on the ownership of bodies, an empire of pleasure sustained by those who had no choice. In ancient Athens, the law drew a cold line between the free and the enslaved. For those trapped in the sex trade, that line erased their humanity entirely. They were not citizens, not even persons in the eyes of the court. They were property. Ownership papers detailed their value, their origin, and the seal of the man who claimed them. Some bore literal marks of possession, brands burned into skin, symbols of the house they served. These scars were both identification and warning, proof that resistance was futile. If a client assaulted or killed a prostitute, the law did not call it murder. It was merely destruction of property. Compensation went not to the victim but to her owner. A woman or boy in bondage could not testify in court unless tortured first. Greek jurists believed truth only came from pain. Refusing a client was considered defiance, punishable by beating, starvation, or resale to harsher masters. Even concubines, though kept in finer quarters, lived under the same shadow. They could bear a master's child, but never earn freedom through it. Legal texts describe how guardians registered these women for taxation, as if they were fields or livestock. The Athenian idea of justice existed only for the free male citizen. Everyone else served to maintain his comfort. And yet, within that silence, some tried to escape, smuggling letters to sympathetic philosophers or fleeing through ports at night. Their stories rarely survived in marble or myth, but their absence tells its own truth. A civilization built on beauty and reason also codified ownership of the human body. Behind the glory of Athens stood laws written in ink and enforced in flesh. From the moment they were purchased, the lives of enslaved girls and boys in ancient Greece followed a system of training designed to break resistance and teach obedience. In state brothels, temple quarters, and private houses, training began early, often before puberty. Older slaves or hired overseers taught them how to serve, how to speak, and above all, how to obey. Punishment was the core of instruction. Any hesitation, mistake, or act of defiance was met with beatings, confinement, or public humiliation. Some were forced to stand for hours in silence to learn stillness. Others were denied food or rest until submission became instinct. Their identities were systematically erased. Names were replaced with nicknames chosen by masters, bodies were inspected like merchandise, and movements were drilled until every gesture pleased a buyer. For women and girls, beauty standards became another form of control. Hair, skin, and posture dictated their value. For boys, strength and youth determined their price. They were told that obedience was safety and that silence was survival. The goal was not education, but conditioning to remove any trace of will or self-respect. Inside these walls, laughter and tears carried the same meaning, response to command. Philosophers and lawmakers justified this cruelty as necessary discipline, believing that slaves lacked the capacity for moral judgment. In reality, it was a method of psychological enslavement, turning human beings into instruments of profit. Behind closed doors, the lessons of civilization were taught through pain, repetition, and fear. The Greeks perfected not just the art of beauty, but the science of breaking the human spirit, a truth that their statues and poems never show. In ancient Athens, pleasure was sold through hierarchy and cruelty. Brothels and private houses categorized enslaved people like products, advertising them by age, origin, and physical traits. Virgins, foreigners, and boys were the most profitable categories, each sold to meet a specific demand shaped by status and fetish. Foreign slaves, especially from Thrace or Asia Minor, were marketed as exotic, their differences turned into selling points. Younger captives were kept in isolation, groomed, and presented as rare commodities for wealthy buyers. Public demand didn't just shape the market, it shaped the abuse. Some clients sought humiliation or visible fear, believing it heightened pleasure. Brothel owners adapted by training captives to act submissive, terrified, or in pain, turning suffering into performance. Ancient texts and vase paintings reveal scenes of power, restraint, and degradation presented as entertainment, evidence that violence itself became part of the attraction. Records from Athenian courts mention disputes over damaged property, referring to enslaved people who were beaten too severely by customers. Yet the outrage was never for the victim, it was for the loss of profit. To satisfy elite tastes, certain houses even specialized in acts of cruelty disguised as luxury. The richer the client, the more extreme the request. For the victims, every night was a transaction of fear, a reminder that their pain had value only when it could be sold. In the heart of one of history's most celebrated civilizations, violence was not hidden, but refined, packaged, and priced. The beauty of Greek art immortalized the human form. The reality of its markets revealed how deeply that form could be broken for pleasure. In ancient Greece, religion and exploitation often walked hand in hand. Festivals dedicated to gods like Dionysus and Aphrodite turned acts of domination into rituals of faith. The line between worship and abuse blurred as enslaved women and boys were used to symbolize fertility, sacrifice, and divine pleasure. During Dionysian festivals, drunken processions filled the streets with chanting, wine, and ecstatic chaos. Behind the celebration, temple servants, many of them slaves, were forced to perform for crowds, their bodies treated as sacred instruments rather than human beings. In some cities, temples maintained groups of sacred attendants, enslaved for life to serve the god's will. These people were not volunteers. They were offerings bought or captured, handed over to priests who managed their labor and bodies in the name of devotion. In Corinth, temple prostitution was an open institution, with thousands of enslaved women working under religious sanction. The practice was praised as piety, an offering to Aphrodite that ensured the city's prosperity. Rituals involving dance, music, and intoxication disguised the reality of coercion, turning suffering into spectacle. The more lavish the ceremony, the more invisible the victims became. Greek writers celebrated these festivals as expressions of freedom and spiritual release, yet behind every hymn stood the silence of those forced to play their part. Religion gave the system moral cover. It transformed organized exploitation into divine duty and placed human suffering beneath the shadow of God's. The faith that preached beauty and harmony also sanctified pain when it served power. Beneath the hymns and incense, the temples of Greece became theaters of control, where devotion was measured not by belief, but by the obedience of the enslaved. Discipline in ancient Greece's slave system was not about correction, it was about domination. Every act of punishment served as a warning to others. Beatings were common, delivered in public courtyards where screams became part of daily soundscapes. Overseers used whips, rods, and ropes not only to wound, but to remind captives of their place. In brothels and private homes alike, starvation was used to break defiance. Meals were withheld for days until obedience returned, reducing human beings to desperate shells willing to submit for survival. Public humiliation was another tool of control. Slaves accused of disobedience were paraded through streets with shaved heads, chained ankles, or signs hung around their necks describing their crime. For women, this humiliation was often sexualized, forced exposure, mockery, or confinement in cages. These punishments were justified as discipline, a means of protecting the owner's investment. Philosophers like Aristotle wrote that slaves were living tools, animate property that required pain to function. Such thinking made cruelty rational, even moral, in the eyes of the law. A master who killed a slave rarely faced consequence. The loss was measured in money, not morality. In the public eye, control was civilization's proof of order. But inside the walls, where no witnesses stood, punishment became ritual. Every scar, every bruise, every silence reinforced the system. Fear was the currency that kept obedience cheap and rebellion unthinkable. The same society that praised balance and beauty in art sustained itself through calculated brutality. To rule another's body was seen as natural, to break their spirit necessary. The Greeks built their ideals of freedom upon the suffering of those who had none. Escape was the only dream many dared to hold, but in ancient Greece, freedom was almost impossible. For enslaved women and courtesans, the world beyond the brothel or the master's home offered no refuge. Laws, guards, and public shame all worked together to bring them back. Those who tried were hunted like fugitives, tracked through ports and markets by hired men. Posters bearing descriptions of missing slaves were nailed to city walls, offering rewards for their capture. Even sympathetic citizens risked punishment for helping them. When caught, the punishment was meant to destroy both body and spirit. Floggings left scars that never healed. Branding irons burned ownership marks into flesh, letters or symbols that declared a person escaped property. Some were forced to march through the agora as examples, their burns displayed for all to see. A few were executed publicly to warn others that flight meant death. The message was clear: obedience was survival, defiance was erasure. Still some tried. A slave might steal a small sum or disguise themselves as a free laborer to board a ship leaving Athens. Others hid in temples, hoping that divine law might protect them where human law would not. But even sanctuary had limits. Priests often returned escapees for payment. For women in the sex trade, escape often meant another form of captivity, sold again under a new name. The few who vanished completely became whispers, ghosts of defiance in a world built on control. Their stories rarely appeared in Greek writing. yet the silence itself speaks. Every scar, every brand, every name erased from record tells us how fragile hope was and how much courage it took simply to run. In the brothels and slave quarters of ancient Greece, disease was as constant as the trade itself. Overcrowded rooms, reused bedding, and the absence of clean water turned every touch into a risk. There were no doctors for the enslaved, only crude healers who treated injuries with wine, ash, or superstition. Inscriptions and early medical writings show that infections, fevers, and venereal diseases spread rapidly among prostitutes and their clients alike. For those forced into the trade, pain was part of routine. Sores, bruises, and untreated wounds were ignored until they crippled or killed. A slave's life had no medical value beyond the profit they could still generate. When illness struck, most were left to recover or die on their own. Greek physicians like Hippocrates wrote extensively about anatomy and purity, yet their compassion rarely extended to slaves or women. Medical care was a privilege of the free. Brothel owners often used harsh herbal mixtures or fumigation to mask disease rather than cure it. Those too sick to work were sold cheaply or discarded. In temple quarters, priests claimed divine rituals could cleanse sickness, mixing faith with neglect. Death came quietly, often in the same bed where business had been done hours before. Life expectancy for sex slaves was tragically short. Many died before 30, their bodies buried without ceremony or record. The system that glorified beauty ignored the decay it created. Behind the ideals of health, purity, and perfection, ancient Greece hid a culture that consumed human lives faster than it could name them. Disease was not just a symptom, it was a sentence passed on to those whose only crime was being owned. In the brothels and slave quarters of ancient Greece, pregnancy was not a blessing, it was a problem to be erased. For women forced into sex work, the body was not their own, and conception threatened profit. When a slave became pregnant, the owner faced a loss of income and control. The solution was cruelly efficient: forced abortions, crude remedies, and silence. Midwives were ordered to end pregnancies using herbal mixtures, sharp instruments, or pressure methods that often left women bleeding, sterile, or dead. There was no mercy, only management. If a child was born, it rarely lived long. Infants fathered by clients or masters carried no status, no inheritance, and no right to exist. Some were smothered at birth, others left outside the city walls, exposed to die from cold, hunger, or animals. In Athens and Corinth, discarded babies were a common sight near dumps or temple edges where silence replaced mourning. Even philosophers who shaped Greek morality justified such acts. Aristotle himself wrote that deformed or unnecessary children should not be raised. The idea of selective survival became a principle of order. For enslaved mothers, grief was forbidden. Cry or protest was defiance. A woman who hid her pregnancy risked torture or death if discovered. Those who delivered in secret faced impossible choices, abandonment or execution. The system left no space for compassion. Even motherhood was denied. The same society that celebrated fertility goddesses like Aphrodite and Demeter turned childbirth into an act of punishment for the enslaved. In the ruins of those ancient cities, archaeologists still find the remains of infants buried in jars or beneath brothel floors, mute witnesses to an economy where life itself was expendable. Behind every fragment of beauty carved in marble, there once lay a silence that screamed. They were called hetairai, the favorites of Athens. Draped in fine linen, perfumed, and taught in music and philosophy, these women seemed to live above the rest. They dined beside philosophers, advised politicians, and became muses for artists. Yet beneath the golden marble they were never free. The illusion of luxury hid a deeper bondage, a cage gilded with admiration. Unlike the common slaves of the brothels, hetairai were educated to entertain not just bodies, but minds. They could own nothing, decide nothing, and their beauty was their leash. Every jewel, every banquet, every poem written in their honor was bought with obedience. Even their fame belonged to the men who sponsored them. Some were granted homes, servants, or even public respect, yet their worth lasted only as long as their youth and favor. Behind the scenes, their lives were tightly controlled. They signed no contracts, for their word had no legal standing. The same men who praised their wit also traded them when interest faded. Old age or illness meant exile from luxury, cast out into poverty, or sold into lower houses. To remain desirable was a daily performance of grace and silence. History remembers them as icons of sophistication. Figures like Aspasia, lover of Pericles, celebrated for her intelligence and charm. But even she lived under suspicion, accused of corruption and impiety for daring to influence men. The myth of the liberated courtesan concealed a truth. She was property in silk, a prisoner admired for her chains. The hetairae embodied Greece's contradiction, civilization's most elegant mask covering the face of control. Their laughter filled the symposiums of Athens, but every smile was survival. Their beauty built legends. Their captivity built the world's first illusion of freedom within slavery. In ancient Greece, beauty was currency, and when it faded, so did the worth of those forced to sell it. For enslaved women and courtesans, aging was not a stage of life but a sentence. Once their youth dimmed, they became burdens in an economy that valued only pleasure. Brothel owners sold them cheaply to harsher houses or sent them to work as cleaners, servants, or street beggars. The transition from luxury to ruin could happen overnight. Those once dressed in silk found themselves clothed in rags, sleeping in corners of the same streets where they had once been desired. No law protected them. No record preserved their names. The city that had cheered their beauty turned away from their decay. Some were abandoned outside the walls of Athens or left to die in slums near the ports. A few sought refuge in temples, hoping mercy might replace memory, but even there, old slaves were seen as offerings too worn to serve. Historians rarely mention them. Greek art immortalized eternal youth, and so the aged disappeared not only from sight, but from history. Their deaths went unmarked, their bodies often unburied or dumped in pits with the poor. To the men who once praised their grace, they had simply ceased to be useful. The silence surrounding them was deliberate, a cleansing of discomfort from civilization's story. In a world that worshipped perfection, there was no place for the broken or the used. The same culture that sculpted timeless gods could not bear to face its mortal victims. Behind every statue of beauty stood generations of women whose faces were forgotten when they could no longer please. Their vanishing was not natural, it was designed. Athens called itself the cradle of civilization, a city of art, wisdom, and democracy. But beneath its marble ideals lay the quiet rot of hypocrisy. The same philosophers who wrote of virtue and love built their legacies on silence. Plato spoke of divine beauty, Aristotle of moral order, and poets of eternal desire, but none spoke for the women who bore its cost. The suffering that sustained their enlightenment was erased from memory, buried under rhetoric and stone. The word love was purified in theory and defiled in practice. The beauty celebrated in statues and symposiums came from bodies stripped of choice. Slaves were painted as muses, their pain renamed inspiration. When artists carved the perfect form, they carved over the scars of the living. The philosophers who debated justice over wine ignored the injustice pouring from the same cups. Civilization became a mirror polished with blood. Even temples that preached devotion to goddesses like Aphrodite and Hera were built by hands that broke women. Worshippers offered garlands and prayers to the divine feminine, yet denied real women the right to exist beyond pleasure. The contradiction was not hidden, it was normalized. To question it was to challenge the gods themselves. History remembers Greece for its beauty, its intellect, its democracy. But in truth, it perfected a subtler tyranny, the power to erase its own cruelty behind art and philosophy. The brothel and the academy were never separate worlds. They were two faces of the same civilization, one shaped by words, the other by wounds. Every marble statue still gleaming under museum lights carries the same unspoken truth. Greece taught the world how to worship beauty and how to bury the people who paid for it. For centuries, the image of ancient Greece has been polished until it gleams, white marble, noble ideals, and enlightened desire. Modern historians, artists, and films have turned its world into a fantasy of beauty and intellect, where love is poetic and freedom universal. But the truth beneath that perfection is far darker. The same culture now romanticized for passion and philosophy was built on human ownership, sexual coercion, and systematic exploitation. Museums display marble bodies as ideals of art, stripped of their origins in slavery. Hollywood turns heterae into heroines and philosophers into symbols of progress, editing out the chains, the hunger, and the silence that made their stories possible. The brutality of ancient Greece has been buried beneath aesthetics, a civilization remembered for beauty, not for the broken lives that funded it. Even academia is not innocent. Textbooks praise democracy but rarely mention that it thrived on the unpaid labor of the enslaved. They call courtesans companions, ignoring how little choice they had. The myths of refined love erase the trauma behind it. By softening history, we have inherited its hypocrisy. The West still worships Greece as its origin, but what we inherited was not truth. It was a curated illusion. Modern society continues to echo those same contradictions. We celebrate beauty and intellect while ignoring exploitation that sustains them. Greece's legacy lives not only in art and politics, but in the way history itself chooses what to remember and what to silence. The past was rewritten into myth, and the myth became a mirror. What survives today is not Greece as it was, but Greece as we wanted it to be, polished, idealized, and cleansed of its cruelty. Civilization's greatest achievement was not art, it was amnesia. Every civilization hides the cost of its beauty. For Greece, it was the silence of those whose names were never carved in stone. The artists, philosophers, and lawmakers are remembered, but the enslaved, the broken, and the forgotten were the ones who built the world they celebrated. Behind every ideal of freedom stood someone who was denied it. We look back at marble temples and call them masterpieces. But what if the real masterpiece was not the art, but the illusion? The illusion that greatness can exist without cruelty, that progress can be pure, that beauty can be born without pain. Every statue, every poem, every pillar of history carries the fingerprints of those erased from it. And now, centuries later, we are the inheritors of that silence. We praise civilizations for their brilliance, but how often do we ask who paid for it? The truth of history is not just in what survives, but in what was buried to make survival possible. To remember, that is not to destroy the past, it is to see it honestly. If this story moved you, share it. Speak their names again in the comments below. Subscribe to uncover the untold chapters of history, the voices that time tried to erase. Because every empire, every legend, every civilization has its shadow. And until we face it, beauty will always come at a cost.